Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni muli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jadley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast, an iHeartRadio Best Kids and Family Podcast Award nominee. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you so much for joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show in the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcasts. Our guest today is Ryan Dalton. He is here to celebrate this last adventure. It's a really, really powerful book talking about the relationship between a 13-year-old boy and his grandfather who's suffering from Alzheimer's. Before we invite Ryan into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Carry Me Home by Janet Fox. This is really a beautiful book for young readers that is all about a family that becomes homeless due to unforeseen circumstances. But it's primarily about community, about compassion, and kindness. The main character is a 12-year-old named Lulu. Lulu and her sister Serena, they live in a car with their dad. When he goes missing, Lulu is forced to take care of herself and Serena with almost no money, clothes that aren't warm enough, and with the fear that if somebody finds out about this situation, the girls may be separated forever. The book is fiction, but unfortunately it tells a story that too many people, too many kids are experiencing today. It's a wonderful book that can inspire some really important conversations that can remind us and our kids that we are all part of one beautiful human family and we all have responsibility to care for others. Carry Me Home by Janet Fox. Beautiful, beautiful book. Joining us right now from St. Louis and the wonderful state of Missouri, our guest today is here to celebrate his brand new middle grade novel. It's called The Last Adventure. Please welcome to the show, Ryan Dalton. Hey, Ryan, how are you?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm like wicked jealous. You got that radio voice, and I got this. So, I don't know. I feel like I'm on the wrong side of the interview.
Hey, you're still the expert here.
Well, we'll see about that. But you are the expert when it comes to The Last Adventure. Tell us about this book, please.
Sure. Yeah, it's actually This Last Adventure. I know it's easy to hear the, but This Last Adventure. It's a middle grade book. It's contemporary with just a little dash of fantasy, and it follows a 13-year-old boy who tries to use storytelling and interactive fantasies to save his grandfather's memories from Alzheimer's disease. So much of it is in the real world, but then there are these fantasy sequences where he tries to use kind of shared fantasies and worlds that he creates to help keep off the effects of Alzheimer's.
Wow. So talk about this a little bit more, because Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's are subjects we've touched on here on the podcast a lot because they're subjects that kids and older people my age have to deal with. Many of our loved ones, because we're living longer, suffer from dementia, and we know so little about it, and it's such a devastating disease that it obviously tears up the person that's suffering from it, but it also does a number. I think the people, the loved ones, suffer more from it. So talk a little bit about that relationship and what the hero of the story is doing to kind of stay connected with the grandfather.
Sure, yeah. And I think you're absolutely right, about the effects that it has upon the family. In fact, my grandfather died from Alzheimer's at the end of 2017. That was largely the inspiration behind this. There are adaptations of real things that actually happened in the book. And it really, you see it from both sides in the book, both from the person suffering from it and the things that they go through. and then very much how that radiates out into the family, and especially as you go through the different stages where maybe it starts early and you see the early signs, but then as you can see it progressing, that changes the effects that it has on the family, not just emotionally, but in the ways that they have to deal with it and the questions they start having to ask about, well, okay, what do we do now? And so I came at it from the angle of, I didn't want to write a book that was just depressing and just about this dark subject, for something for which there is no cure. So I wanted to come at it from an angle of this boy who would approach something like this with hope, and with trying to do something proactive to help. And when I kind of came up with that angle, like, okay, the story isn't really about, the tragedy is in there, but it's not about that. It's trying to hold on to hope in the midst of that. That's really kind of the theme that I decided to deal with in the book.
Yeah. Now, I'm imagining some people listening to this would be kind of scratching their heads and saying, why would you want somebody to hold on to hope when there is no hope? But as I'm listening to you, I kind of get the feeling that you have to find hope. Otherwise, you give up, and you give up the connection that you have with your loved one. Absolutely,
yeah. And I think the hope helps you appreciate any good times, as they kind of happen less and less, that it helps you hold on to those. And I think having hope probably would inform your decisions, as a family about what you're going to do and how you're going to approach things. And I think even if knowing there's a disease that doesn't have any known cure, I think a certain measure of hope just helps with your sanity. And, the book also deals with, hey, in times, even in tragedy and sickness, there are times where you just have to laugh. And there are situations where you can sit there and cry, or you can choose to see the humor, the dark humor in something and go with that, because sometimes that's what preserves your sanity, really, in those situations. And so, it was a lot about just the characters, especially the main character, Archie, making the choice to deal with it in that way instead of just giving into it.
Yeah. It sounds like in many ways Archie just made this decision that I'm going to live in the now. I'm going to appreciate what I have at this moment.
That's part, I would say that's an undertone. He, because he's a 13-year-old kid, he's not going to think about it really in those terms. The way that he's going to see it, as an adult, you could say, okay, he's definitely making the choice to kind of be hopeful. From Archie's point of view, this is his hero ever since, he can remember. And they have both shared this love of stories and this love of books and fantasy ever since he can remember. And it's how he essentially gives back to his hero and, tries to do his part to save and help his hero the way he feels like his hero has been there for him his whole life. So that's really the part that's on Archie's mind, is how can he be the hero that he has had his whole life.
What a beautiful, beautiful story.
Oh, thank you.
Because I think it's, we've talked a lot here on the show about the fact that, especially in the culture here in the United States, we don't celebrate the intergenerational relationships as much as they're celebrated in other cultures in Latin America, in Asia. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're spread out and we're not living in the same towns and the same communities anymore. We're living across the country. But this is, and I love the image of Archie's hero being his grandfather. One of my heroes was my grandmother. And we had a beautiful relationship. And I was also very close to my grandfather, who passed when I was 16. And I don't see as many kids having those close relationships with their grandparents as before. And I think that's a loss, because those are really special relationships.
Yeah, very much so. And this story is set in a small town. which I feel like helps that a little bit, helps with that generational bond. And one of the things that you do see kind of happen in the story, and this doesn't really give anything big away, is that you have younger people in the family that are, I guess more modern, who have drifted away to their own things a little bit, but this tragedy that's starting to happen ends up actually serving to bring the family back together, and they're forced together essentially to have to deal with this thing. But in being forced together to deal with it, they reveal a lot of depth, and are able to have unexpected moments where they can bond over this, but also over other things. And I've always liked that that family and group dynamic, writing ensemble things like that. This family actually surprised me a little bit, because when I first started writing the story, I envisioned Archie as this character who's surrounded by sort of this, quirky, weird family, and they all have their individual weird things, and they are still kind of quirky and silly. But at the same time, as the story was developing and I was writing, the family ended up revealing a lot more of themselves and a lot more depth than I had originally planned, which I really enjoyed, because as scenes would continue on and develop, and family would be in the room with each other and talking to each other, the characters just sort of revealed things about each other. So that the depth to me that they revealed was a very pleasant surprise.
Now, I'm imagining somebody listening and you talking about this process of how this family that you essentially created revealed things to you. And I know people out there scratching their heads going, wait a minute, dude, you created this. So how is your creation surprising you? I don't know if you're able to explain it. I know when people are asking me where I get inspirations for a story that I tell on stage, I don't know, it popped into my head, and I was really surprised that it popped out, because I'm usually creating it in front of 500 people. But can you talk a little bit more about that, how your characters are surprising you as they're being created?
Sure. So the way that I tend to create, I'm a pretty heavy outliner. So I start out with the overall concept, and then I start, as I develop more of the concept into a workable story, that's when characters kind of come into play. That's when the world starts to present itself, and I start to kind of build and grow them all together. Like as I make character decisions, that informs the world they live in. As I, make some decision about the world that they live in, that's going to reflect in the character. At that point, I still very much have like both hands on the wheel. And I'm still learning really who the characters are going to be. But for me, the characters don't really become who they are until I'm writing them and they're in a scene with other characters. And that, when I kind of get the ball rolling and start the situation, start them talking to each other, that's when they really start to live and breathe and come to life. And that's when it's sort of like the characters get a hand on the wheel as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm still the author, things are still ultimately up to me. But there are definitely things that surprise even me, just because at that point the characters are starting to take on a life and an intelligence of their own. And at that point, I don't know, maybe it's just things pulling from your subconscious, things you've learned about people along the way and learned about life, and it ends up channeling into these characters. And at least for me, that's one of my favorite parts of the process, is when those fine details about the characters start to show up in the story just by putting them in situations.
Now, is this happening as you're kind of sitting and meditating and thinking about the story, or is this happening as you're typing on the keyboard or doing it old school like me, writing it out with a pen and paper?
That part is once I start writing. Mm-hmm. That's when I've got the concept and the world and the characters and my outline to the point where I feel like I can start writing with confidence, knowing ultimately where the story is going, and the major beats of things that I want to happen. That's when I start really like typing up scene by scene. And it's at that point that like final brush stroke on the characters where they become to me like real living people. That's where that happens.
Yeah. Have you ever had a situation where a character is coming to life and then suddenly the character takes a really dark turn and you're, kind of sit back and go, yo, dude, I'm going to have to take you out of the story altogether.
I could think of one example, and it was not a villainous dark turn, and this was in a previous book. I also have a sci-fi trilogy out called the Time Shift Trilogy, and there's one supporting character in that series who is kind of one of the comic relief characters, and he's mouthy and always has something smart to say even when serious things are happening. And there is a point in the series essentially where he kind of goes off on his own and decides to do something that's sort of dark because he knows that the main heroes essentially don't have it in them to do what he feels needs to be done. And so he takes it upon himself to go and do it. And he never, ever tells anybody. So it's really what happens with him is between him and the reader throughout the rest of the series. And I actually really like moments like that, especially when a character who you wouldn't think would do something, again, kind of reveals a hidden aspect of themselves. That it's like, oh no, maybe they would be willing to do this under the right set of circumstances. Those were very different stories than this last adventure is, but still a lot of fun.
Yeah. Was it difficult because you shared with us earlier on that that you went through this, very difficult loss with your grandfather? So I'm guessing that parts of this last adventure have some autobiographical elements to it, and was it difficult bringing up those feelings and kind of writing about something that was so hard for you?
I would say, yeah, it's autobiographical kind of on behalf of my whole family. I wasn't there for everything. I was there for some things. But I was able to, fortunately, my family was very, very supportive when I started doing this, and were very open to me taking the things that I had seen, but also the things that they had experienced and then related to me later. They were very open to me taking those and using some creative license on those to translate them into the story, which I was very grateful for. And in a way, yeah, that does make writing those scenes difficult because it hits kind of close to home. But at the same time, it's like, if you're going to write this kind of story, you've just got to go all in, or there's really no point. And I really wanted to make those feel as real as possible, because I knew there were going to be people reading this who had gone through it as well. People with family with Alzheimer's or dementia or and even any other type of illness that can be debilitating. And so I wanted, even though, so many of the things in the story are fictional, I wanted the emotions of it and those serious parts of it to be as true as possible. And so it was just one of those things where I said, okay, well, there are times where I'm going to have to write a scene and just be completely closed off, doors shut, and just kind of I'll suffer through it, but knowing that it's for a purpose. And so, yeah, I think ultimately it came out the right way because of that.
Yeah. Why did you choose the middle grade novel?
It's funny. It was a very deliberate choice after writing a YA trilogy. One of my early questions when I decided on the themes of the book and what I wanted the tone to be, I realized that I had to make it middle grade, and I was happy to, of course, but because that same kind of story, if you're going to tell it, I think, as a young adult book, I think would end up needing to be a lot darker and feel a lot more bleak. And largely it's because the main character wouldn't be able to do the things that a 13-year-old character is willing to do. A 13-year-old kid is willing to suspend a lot more disbelief in real life than, say, a 16 or 17-year-old kid. And so I knew to have a main character that would be willing and like mentally and emotionally in a place where they could live in that space where they know things are bad, but their hope is still powering the things that they're doing, that it would have to be a younger child. And so it pretty much made the decision for me that it was going to be middle grade.
Yeah. A lot of times we ask authors what kind of conversations they think families can have. I think just that conversation about grandfather, grandmother, aunt, uncle, I think are really obvious. that this last adventure can absolutely inspire those conversations that can be life-changing for kids and for family members. I'm wondering how writing this last adventure changed you.
Wow, great question. How did it change? Well, I'll give you kind of two answers. As a writer, it definitely changed me by broadening my horizons about the type of story that I feel like I can do. Because when I was first deciding whether I was going to do this, part of what I hesitated with is, I'd come off of writing these big kind of bombastic sci-fi time travel mystery stories, and I was thinking of going to this other story that was intensely personal and largely very quiet. And at first I was thinking, man, there's no villain, there's nobody to punch, there's no bad guy. I mean, the villain is a disease that you can't see. And then as I was thinking about, okay, well, how do I do it? I came to understand, at least for me, how I would do it, in that I would essentially develop the story the same way. It's just that I would, for me, instead of it being these world-ending stakes, the emotions and the interpersonal stories would be those world-ending stakes. And I could write an emotional down point or a character climax. There's the exact same way that I would, a world-saving action scene. I just would do it with words and emotions and very small actions by regular people. And when I came to the point that I realized, I can treat this very similarly. It's just the tools in your hand are a little bit different. That's when I shed a lot of the fear of it. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, I can do this. And so as a writer, I would say it definitely changed me that way. It definitely made me look more, I would say, just as a person. It was a learning experience getting more of those stories from my family about mm-hmm. things that they went through. There are lots of things I was aware of before I started writing, but as I was going through it, I got more stories from family, things that I didn't know and hadn't heard about before. And, it ends up really helping you to see the family that went through it and had their own different experiences. You see them in a different light. You grow closer to them as you learn. And so that was great. I got to learn more and understand my family even better.
Yeah. And I hope folks that are listening can kind of remember that, because as important as it is to talk with each other and support each other while our loved one is suffering from Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or dementia, I think it's important too to have those conversations afterwards and to just kind of come together and we were there for each other when we went through it. We're here for each other now that it's over and we're moving on.
Very true.
Yeah. I know, people, because you've teased us a little bit about your other books. Just tell us a little bit more about your trilogy.
Sure. Those are a few years old now, but that was called the Time Shift Trilogy. And that was a series of time travel mysteries. The first one's called The Year of Lightning. That was my debut book. That was my first published novel. And those are very different from this last adventure. But it does share. I would say you'd probably see some similar DNA in some things. There's still there's a fairly large cast of characters, and so my favorite things are, like I said, group dynamics and scenes of dialogue between these friends and family, and you still find that in those books. There are still actually intergenerational relationships because you have. Because it's a time travel story, you can have some threats that span generations. And so you find out some interesting things about how, things that are happening now in the story have echoes into the past and into the future and things. And so you could see from the interpersonal side a little bit of probably my same writing DNA. But they're definitely more, they're fairly action heavy. The first one starts out fairly localized in one place, but especially starting in book 2, you expand out to find this whole universe and like how a whole system of time travel and time manipulation works. And it was a big, grand, sweeping epic by the end of it.
Awesome.
About as different as you can get from this last adventure.
Yeah, that's great. I got to tell you, sometimes the time traveling thing, when I was younger, and that would be cool to go back in time. But then if you did something that could like erase a whole neighborhood of people, and then I don't forget what character it was, went back and met his mother when his mother was in high school. I'm like, nah, this.
Well, actually, when I started writing that series, that's when I became a very heavy outliner. Because when I was planning the first book, I thought, with time travel and how mind-bending that is, and with as many characters as I have, if I don't really take this by both hands and plan even more than I need to, then it's going to wiggle right out of my grasp. So that's what turned me into a heavy outliner.
Cool. Well, I know people are going to want to know where they can go to find out more about this last adventure and also find out more about Ryan Dalton.
Sure. So my website is ryandaltonwrites.com. You can go there. There's information about all of my books. And this last adventure is up for pre-order now. So if you go to the website, you can find links to any number of booksellers. There's some indie booksellers that I put on there. Also put Amazon links, and it's on Goodreads. It's pretty much anywhere you can buy and pre-order books. It's available now. And on my website, if there's any educators or librarians, teachers, I do have information about school and library visits and the details of that. And if anybody wants to reach out to me personally, they can find me on Twitter. And then I have my email address is on my website. Anyone who wants to talk to me, I'm an open book. Feel free to come and ask.
Very cool. Very cool. We've had a great time speaking to. We covered a lot of ground tonight, Ryan.
We did.
Yeah, it was cool. We've been talking about this last adventure with the author Ryan Dalton. Hey, Ryan, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, thanks for having me. This is great.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Dr. Jean Maradian. She'll be back on the podcast to celebrate Francine, easy for me to say, Francine and her special talents. Hey, if you're the author of a fantastic children's book, we would love to help you tell the world all about it. You can be a guest on the podcast. Being a guest is fun. It's easy. It doesn't cost a thing. And it gives you a chance to tell thousands of people about your fantastic children's book. You can also submit your book to our Certified Great Read panel. And if they believe that your book is worthy of 4 or 5 out of 5 stars, it becomes a Certified Great Read, letting families know that your book is worthy of their consideration. You can also take part in our monthly promotion program. This is an amazing program that will celebrate your book through commercials on the podcast. We'll send out messages to our 65,000 plus social media followers, and also have your book displayed on our nationwide network of digital pedestrian billboards. You can learn all about these services by going to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, clicking the Authors Click Here button at the top of the page, and scroll on down to our various services. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Ryan Dalton. Please be sure to check out This Last Adventure. Also want to thank our sponsor, Janet Fox. Be sure to check out Carry Me Home. My team deserves a thank you. Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we think you all deserve a thank you as well. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.